So we do have a lot of information to cover, and I think we're going to jump right in. Hopefully we'll have some more participants join us as we go. But let's go ahead and get started. You are in the workshop for Demystifying the Literature Review, and the goal of this workshop is to kind of just enter the idea of what a literature review is and how you might get started in writing one if you were planning on doing that. My name is Kimberly, and I am the Instructional Services and Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Missouri, which means that I work a lot with social science departments, but I help assist in writing literature reviews a fair amount. And my partner in this presentation is Christy Goldsmith, who is over at the campus writing program, and so she works with faculty and graduate students a fair amount in their research and writing process as well. So we're going to kind of go ahead and jump right on in.
Thanks for joining us. I almost said good morning because what is time these days, right? But good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here. So those of us in writing studies know that writing is a generative process, which means to write well, we have to write a lot, and we have to practice writing in a lot of different venues. So we're hoping to kick off today by asking you to write a bit with us. We have a few questions for you to help you think about different facets of a literature review. So here they are. What is the purpose of a literature review? We're also wondering what you think, what components a literature review contains, and what process do you undertake in a literature review? So we're asking you to pick one of those questions, whichever one you want, and pull up the chat box if you feel so inclined. And that'll be at the bottom of your screen. There's a little menu there, and it says chat. And we're going to set a timer for a little less than 3 minutes. And if you could just free write, attempt to answer one of these questions. And if you answer one and you still have time left, move on to the second one. So pick a question, take a couple minutes, and write in the chat box and attempt to answer that question. All right, thank you so much for being interactive with us. There's some excellent ideas in here, and we have a lot of good foundational knowledge about literature reviews. A few points I found interesting, and then I'll invite Kimberly to weigh in on a few points she found interesting, was the question of audience. So some folks in the chat noted that literature reviews are meant to show the field what's important, what's new, something about the body of literature. But other people in the chat noted that it's for learning yourself, right? Trying to figure out yourself what's going on in the literature, what might be connected to your own topic of interest. That point of audience is really interesting and definitely varied. I also noticed a lot of really neat verbs in here. So explore, summarize, detail, explain, and those are all related actions, but certainly they have a little bit of different nuances to them. So we're going to talk about when you might want to explain versus when you might want to summarize or organize into themes today. What else did you notice, Kimberly?
So I liked what you said about the verbs, about explaining and summarizing. I saw that a fair amount. I also noticed that many people answered the first question, possibly just because it is the first question, but it didn't seem like as many people were interested in talking about the process. So I think maybe that's something that we can focus on while we're going into this. And another thing that I think I would often use when describing a literature review is this idea of finding where the gaps are. When you look at a literature review or you're writing a literature review, you're seeing what's out there on a topic and you're synthesizing it together and you're summarizing, but it also lets you know what's not there. So if you're doing research, you're trying to find, okay, well, what's not there so I can then write in that field. Or if you're trying to look for a field and you're new to graduate school or you're new to research and you're like, okay, well, where are there gaps? Where can I fit my research in? And to be new and exciting, looking at literature reviews is a really good way to find those gaps and say like, oh, well, there's all this stuff on this topic, but here's what hasn't been studied yet. So I think that's a really good purpose for using literature reviews too. I am going to start moving ahead, but really quickly, I do want to say now that we have a few more participants who have joined us, I know that if you are an undergraduate right now, there's the STAR program on campus, STAR, and you get credit for being in this workshop. So that might be the reason you're here. And if that's true, please privately message me in the chat, and I will make sure to document that and send it to the individual who's in charge of that with the undergraduate research program. So just to know, if you want part of the credit for the STAR program, message me in the chat and let me know, and then I'll make sure that you get that credit. Okay, so moving on, we've done our quick write. The next thing that I want to cover is what a literature review is. And this is kind of that question we just asked, but I think it's important to highlight because in the world of academic literature, we talk about this phrase a lot, we use this phrase a lot, but it can really mean 3 different things. So I think it's important to define it and actually discuss what we mean when we say literature review. The first of these is pretty straightforward. It's the background for an article. Every academic article that you read is going to have a background section. Sometimes it's called a literature review, sometimes it's called background, sometimes it's called an introduction. It really just depends on what that journal's policy is, what their outline looks like, but there's always going to be a section at the beginning of every academic article that tells you what's happened in the field before. It gives context to the research that comes after and what the researcher is talking about. So you can read their research and know how it fits into the larger conversation of that field. So a background article, it doesn't have to be comprehensive. It's just enough so that your reader can understand what's going on when they read more into your paper and they dig into the original research that's been done. So that's number one. Number two, a review article. This is an article where the entire thing, the entire paper is actually a review. There's not new research that's produced unless you consider the synthesizing of information that's already existed. So everything in the article is going to be examining research that's already been done, that's already been written about. And there's three varieties of this review article. The first, the general literature review, is just kind of a summary. It's saying, hey, here's what's out there in the field, make of it what you will. This is the research that's been done. The second kind is a systematic review, and that's a little bit more complex. A systematic review says, here's everything that's out there, but here's what it means. Like, I've seen paper A uses these methods and these variables and these outcomes, and paper B uses a completely different set of methods and outcomes. So how do we compare those two? And the systematic review breaks it down and tries to compare those and say, okay, well, maybe in medicine, we've been using this drug. There's been a lot of different case studies. How do we compile all of those case studies to see if it's effective or to see which medicine maybe is the most effective? So a systematic review doesn't just give you the information, it kind of tries to tell you what it means. And the third part there, a meta-analysis, is like a systematic review, but with data. It's very quantitative. They use numbers and statistics and percentages. So if you like numbers, meta-analysis might be for you. And I have a diagram off to the right-hand side here that I think helps visualize this a little bit more easily. Everything that we just talked about is considered a literature review, but a systematic review is a specific kind of literature review. Again, it synthesizes a bit more, it tells you what it means. And a meta-analysis is a kind of systematic review. It tells you what it means, but it does so with numbers. So these are all kind of the same idea or the same concept. It's more a matter of execution and how it's done. And I do want to highlight this. These are very specifically written articles, because just like any good research, it needs to be reproducible. You can't just say, oh, well, I found these articles and here's the conclusion I drew, the end. You have to have a methodology section that explains how you came up with the articles that you used. And we'll talk about that a bit more in detail later. The third kind of literature review, remember, we've got article background, we've got an entire article that's a review, and then we have the background for a dissertation. And this kind of combines the other two. It doesn't need to be as comprehensive and reproducible as a review article. It doesn't have to be something where you keep track of every article and where you found it and why you kept it or why you didn't, but it does need to be comprehensive enough that you can prove your research is original and no one else has done anything like it before. So you're kind of in that between ground where you want to have enough background that people reading your research have context, but you also have enough that they can see it's original and your work is unique. So that brings me to the question of which kind of literature review are you interested in? Why are you attending this session? Do you want to know about article backgrounds? Do you want to know about dissertation writing? Or do you want to know about writing literature review articles like systematic reviews and meta-analyses? So feel free to drop that in the chat if you are interested, and let me know which one you might like us to focus on.
Kimberly, as folks are having a minute to put that in the chat, we had a good question. How will the participants get access to these slides? Will they be sent to them after the session's over?
We can share them after the session's over.
If you're okay with that, I am as well.
I am. There's also, this is being recorded and we can share the recording.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying dissertation, a couple people saying systematic reviews, but most of them seem to be saying dissertation. Okay, so dissertation, also general literature reviews that fit into dissertations. Okay, how can you tell the difference between a general and a systematic review? A general literature review is going to just be a summary. They're usually a lot shorter, maybe like 3 to 4 pages. A systematic review has a table. If it's got that table in it, you know it's either a systematic review or a meta-analysis. Literature review just kind of summarizes, but it doesn't have that entire grid where they look at all of the different outcomes and they look at what's used to produce those outcomes. So a systematic review typically is a lot longer, and then also has one of those big tables where it says this article used this measure and had these outcomes, and this was the population, and yeah. It's a lot more detailed about each article individually rather than summarizing. So good question. Okay, so moving on then, we're going to talk more specifically about dissertations. The first step of any literature review, any of those 3, is to actually start searching and to start finding materials to use. And that's where you would hopefully come and talk to your librarian. We do have librarians who are experts in each subject area. I tend to work more with social sciences, but you can always work with your librarian to do these parts of searching that are mentioned here. Creating a search string, this is the terminology in your field that's going to be used. Sometimes, for example, I'm a librarian, so a stereotype might be, I would write a paper on cats, right? But if I say cats and you say felines, we don't find both articles. So you have to kind of gather all of those different terms that might be used in your field. Has the language changed over time? If you're working in psychology, the terminology might be much different now than it was even 5 years ago. So you kind of want to gather all those pieces and put them together to create a search string. We're going to look at that in an example soon. The reproducibility aspect is also really important for a systematic review, literature review, review article, that second category we talked about, because again, like any good research, it has to be something that someone else could recreate and prove was quality, that you didn't just come up with those numbers or come up with those articles. And part of reproducibility is creating criteria. Oftentimes we call these inclusion or exclusion criteria. They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. So if I say, okay, my inclusion criteria is that I only want articles from the last 5 years, my field's really moving and changing, and anything that's older than 5 years maybe isn't as relevant anymore. Then my inclusion would be 5 years. My exclusion would be anything older than 5 years, if that makes sense. One of the systematic reviews I wrote recently, we were looking at a topic where there were a lot of articles on minors, and we decided, no, we only want to work with adult populations, so we're including adult populations and we're excluding minors under 18. So that knowing that criteria, and then when you write up your methodology, being able to state that, so someone else recreating that study would say like, oh, this is why they included these articles and why they didn't look at those, is really important. And the last part of this is citation management. Anytime you're writing a literature review, this is very true for dissertations as well, you really should find a way to organize and keep your citations in one place. It's going to save you a lot of time. You might write down a quote and then later think you'll remember it, but you won't, at least I don't. So having a citation management tool is really helpful. There are tools that will literally write your bibliography for you. And I'm going to show you that as well. But what I'm going to do now is jump from this screen to the library's website and run a quick search just to kind of show you a few search strategies in that string that I mentioned. Hopefully this is a little bit of an overview. That's not really what this session is about. So we'll learn a couple of tricks, but if you want to know more, talk to your librarian. I'm going to use the idea of computer games with education for students who have autism. It's come up a lot in different classes that I've worked with recently. I think it's a good example, but it kind of has a lot of different moving pieces that will let us see what works. First and foremost, I use that gray search box just in the middle of the library's homepage. I do want to mention that's a discovery layer. It's unique to the University of Missouri. It is not reproducible. So if you're using a systematic review or you're writing a literature review, don't use it. If you're doing background for an article or a dissertation, it can be a really good place to get started. So just something to keep in mind. If you're off campus, you're also going to see this bar across the top to log in. And you will want to do that just so you have access to all of these materials. You should have access no matter where you are in the world. It doesn't require you to be on campus. It doesn't require you to be in Missouri. Any article that Mizzou has access to, you should as well. So let's let that load for a second. Okay, you can see there's a ton of articles here. We're not even gonna worry about that number yet because we're gonna reduce this down a fair amount. One way to do that is by using these multiple search bars. The and here on the side works like a Venn diagram. So if I say computers and education and autism, now I'm forcing 3 bubbles into that Venn diagram where I only want the overlap where all 3 of these aspects are included. So it's gonna narrow my field down a huge amount. And I do wanna highlight that because I think oftentimes we use and to add things, but when you're researching, and actually narrows your search, it makes it smaller. So and is always a good idea. You can add as many of these fields as you want. The more fields you add, the fewer and fewer and fewer results you will get. Other tricks to know: if you use quotation marks, you'll group words together as a phrase. This narrows your search as well, because now I'm not looking for the word computer off on its own. I'm looking for the phrase computer games. And that's very specific. It's going to find fewer results, but it's really what I'm looking for in this topic. Another trick is the asterisk finds alternate endings. We call this truncation. For this particular example, we would get autism and autistic, and it saves a lot of time. Sorry, my mind blanked there for a second. It can save you a lot of time. The example of psychology I use a lot: if you do psych with an asterisk, you get psychology, psychiatric, psychopharmaceutical, all of these different words only needing to write it out once. So in this particular case, I would probably do educat as well, because then I would get educated, educational, educator, all of those different terms. Last trick that I want to talk about: the and narrows our search, the or expands it. And this kind of goes with that cat feline example that I used earlier. Different terms in the field are going to be used, so it's a really good idea to kind of guess around and play around with what those terms might be. I know these terms right now because I've used this example in class before. If you don't know those terms, that's absolutely okay. Actually, when you start researching a field, it's normal. So look at Wikipedia, look at a background article, or maybe find a couple articles that are actually on your topic and see what words they use and pull those out and then rerun your search. A search isn't a one-time thing. I'm doing it now as an example that way, but oftentimes it's living, it's gonna change as you go. And that is absolutely perfect.
Kimberly, can I interrupt to share a question from the chat that might be useful here? Are all of these tricks, so the and the or and the asterisk, are those specific to Mizzou systems or all search engines? And what about PubMed? Do they work in there?
So all of these tricks that I'm talking about should work universally. They even work in Google Scholar. So if you're a fan of using Google Scholar, all of these tricks should work there. The main difference is in Google Scholar, you don't have the different search bars. So you'll want to use parentheses and treat it kind of like a math equation from algebra, where you bracket off and you're like, solve inside the brackets first, like pick one of these and then move on to the next set of brackets. So you'd write it all out in one long string. But yes, this should work universally in every database. Medical databases are a little bit weird. PubMed, Medline, sometimes CINAHL. CINAHL works both ways because they tend to rely more on MESH or medical subject headings. And so talking to your subject librarian for health sciences is a really good idea in that category. Or you can reach out to me again later. So I'm just going to use this as a quick example so you have an idea of how all of that kind of plays together. And there are a ton of articles. We still wouldn't want to look through that many, but there are other ways that, and these tricks again also exist in every database. So I'm using the homepage as a search. I mentioned it's not reproducible, but you could use all of these tricks in a subject specific database, like PsycInfo would be the psychology one. And that's what you would use when you were doing a systematic review, because then you could write up, hey, I looked in PsycInfo, I found 42 articles on this topic, and then someone else could run that same search in PsycInfo and find those same 42 articles. Other tricks that are usually used and then mentioned in a methodology section would be limiting to peer review. You can limit by date. That's an option here. My computer's a little slow, so I might not go through all of those, but you can use a lot of different limiters on these sides. Just remember that once you run your search, if you're doing something you want to be recreatable, you want to take very careful notes. So when you write it up again, someone could follow along the process that you took. You also have the option of limiting with these drop-down bars. And this is pretty common when you're looking for really specific information, because right now we're looking for these terms anywhere. They could be in the middle of an article, they could be a caption for an image, they're not necessarily the focus of an article. So the narrower search you could have is title. The subject terms are going to be narrow, but a little bit broader than the title. You can kind of see in this first article here, most publications do have a list of main subjects that the author and the publisher have indexed. And so that's kind of where it's pulling from. And then your abstract is going to be the broadest of the narrow categories. It's that whole paragraph description or a summary of the article. So I'm just going to change a few of these to title so you can see the difference it makes. Again, this is just an example search. But again, you would keep track of all of these different details so that when you wrote it up later, everyone else would figure out how you got to this point. Because now I only have 34 articles. That's actually a pretty small number to work with. So if I'm doing the background for an article, I don't need to be comprehensive. This is really useful. Okay, so that's a little bit about searching. I do want to point out, if you're trying to access the articles, some of them are straightforward. They have this PDF full text link, and I think that's pretty Again, pretty straightforward. You just click on it and it's available. Some of them have this Find It at MU button though. And really the difference here is that the search box from the homepage, the vendor that sold us that search box also sold us this article. They did not sell us this particular resource. And so they make theirs look prettier, so we click on it more and then their statistics go up and hopefully MU buys more stuff from them. That's really what it is. So just because you see this Find It at MU button does not mean you don't have access. If you click it, you're going to be directed one of two places. It could be where MU's access is if we also buy materials from that vendor. Or if MU doesn't have access to this particular resource, you'll be redirected to a page where you can request it through interlibrary loan. And libraries are great at sharing things with each other. We love sharing things. So you would just fill out a request and we would reach out and say like, hey, University of Wisconsin, we see you have this paper. Somebody wants to read it. Can we borrow it? They'll say, sure. It's a free process for you completely. It's already covered in tuition and fees and all of those things. So if you see something that you need for your research, please reach out and get it. It's a pretty fast process too for electronic documents. Okay, last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of searching, if you click on the title of an article, you get a lot more options. My favorite part of this is the toolbar on the right side of the page. You do see the abstract, so you get a little bit more detail there. You have all these things you can do with the article. The first one is a permalink that I want to mention. It's technically the last on the list, but it's the first I want to mention because the URL at the top of the page will not work if you send it to yourself. This can be really frustrating if you do a bunch of research and send yourself a bunch of links and then they're broken links and they don't work later. So the permalink instead creates a URL in the middle of the page that goes through the proxy server and actually can be something that you send to yourself, to someone you're doing a group project with, or to an instructor or faculty mentor if they're helping go through your research. So you want that permalink. There is a cite button. Like any citation tool, it can be really useful, but it can sometimes have mistakes, so always double check. This one doesn't have any, but some of the common mistakes we see are the title in caps lock and numbers after the author's name. If the author has a denotation for where they work, sometimes there's a number that shows up. So make sure those aren't yours if you're using these citations and the citation generators, but it can help with figuring out where the italics should go and where the period should go. However, if you're doing a literature review, pulling citations individually like this is pretty time consuming. And it also isn't a great way to organize your research. So instead, we really like to talk about citation management tools. The libraries support too, Mendeley and Zotero. You may have heard of EndNote, but that one's not really free, so I prefer marketing Mendeley and Zotero. And these citation management tools will literally write your bibliography for you. You can organize your information, organize your research, and then when you're writing your paper, you just like keep hitting add citation, it pulls the citation for you, and at the end it writes your bibliography. Super easy, saves yourself a lot of time. And that's what this export button does, is it sends the citation directly to your tool so then you can organize it and use it later. If you're doing a systematic review or a meta-analysis or literature review where you're trying to be comprehensive, what you want to do is send all of these articles to yourself. And you can go through them later, but then you can say like, oh, we searched this location, found 34 articles, and out of those 34, we used maybe 12. But you want to send all 34 to yourself so you can go through them. And at every database, again, all these tricks that I'm showing you are pretty universal. There's going to be a share option. And under that share option, exporting, this is going to be what sends all of those results to me into my citation management tool. So then I have them all in one place later to look at and work through. And I have pulled up my citation management tool. Like I said, I use Mendeley, just so you could kind of get an idea of what that looks like. I've got all of my documents, but there's also groups that I work with on different projects. So one that I'm working on right now is a systematic review on domestic violence shelters and specifically how they interact with human trafficking. And so you can kind of see like, okay, we have all the final articles that we've decided to use, but we also have the entirety of our search results. Like there's a folder for all of the search results. And then we've kind of broken those down into different folders. So I mentioned we decided we weren't going to use minors, so we could shuffle all of those papers about children into this particular folder, and then we don't even have to read them or look at them, but they're counted, so then when we write up our methodology, we know how many we excluded for that reason. You also can see that when we go to final articles, we pulled the PDF. So not only is the citation here, which you can see on the right in the abstract, so we can read through that and get a bit more, but the PDF is there, and if I open up the PDF here, I can edit it and take notes and those things as well. So just knowing this is a tool you have in your back pocket, I think is really a useful thing to use because, I mean, you have it, you're paying for it as part of your tuition. I think Mendeley and Zotero are actually free, but you have support for those things through the libraries. And it saves yourself so much time, especially if you're doing a large dissertation. Like using a citation management tool will save so much frustration and energy. And if you're submitting papers for publications, typically we've all been rejected at least once. Like I've had papers get rejected and then they get accepted somewhere else, which is great. But the first journal I submitted it to might want APA format. And the next journal I submit it to might want MLA or something different. And rather than having to rewrite all those citations, I just click a button and it changes it all for me and I don't have to worry about it. It's literally a 5-second change for me. So again, can't talk enough about them, but I will stop here. The other thing I really like about Mendeley is you'll see at the top there are a couple other pieces of useful details for this tool. Data sets, if you work a lot with data and statistics, it pulls a lot of free data sets that exist online. And then also funding. I know sometimes it's a little easier for some fields to find funding than others. So I have some faculty who really enjoyed that resource. It takes a look at the articles that you've pulled, and then it suggests different funding opportunities that you might be interested in applying for. So different grants that are out there. Okay. So last couple things before I pull this over. I have one more tab at the top. Once you have all of these articles and you've decided you're going to use all of these articles in your paper, one required step now for writing a literature review, if you're doing that review paper, and often for dissertations as well, is to ensure the articles you include are quality, that they're not just somebody who's randomly writing and just put their thoughts down on paper and maybe made stuff up. So there are tools for assessing the quality of articles. CASP and Prisma are at the top of this list, and this is a list that I have, but I'm happy to share it with you. So if you email me after this presentation, I'll send you this list. But these are some checklists that you can go through with each article to verify that they are quality articles, that they should be included in your review or they should be included in your dissertation. So when you get asked, oftentimes this is a requirement when you submit to journals, or if you submit for a grant, oftentimes they'll be like, okay, well, which quality assessment tool did you use? And so here's just kind of a list of some of those ones that exist out there. Okay. So back to the presentation. And my last slide that I have here before I hand things over to Christy is talking about the anatomy of an article. One of the questions that we asked at the very beginning are, what are the components of a literature review? And just like every academic article, there's kind of a formula. You have your introduction or your background or your literature review section. Then you have your methodology section, and that's kind of like how you did the research. So for a normal article, it might be, well, we did a survey, and from that survey, we had 82 participants. And of those 82, it kind of goes through those details. You do the same thing in a review. You would just say, oh, well, we ran these searches. Here are the terms we used. Here are the databases we searched in. Here are the number of articles we found and our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you've got your introduction, you've got your methodology. There's a results section, and the results section kind of is like, here is what we found from those 82 people we surveyed. And then there's a conclusion or a discussion. And I want to highlight this because the conclusion of this discussion is usually where the new information exists. So if you're citing an article, that's where you'll usually pull your citations from. So if you see all these really good pieces of information in the literature review, it's often tempting to cite that and pull that information out because it's like, oh, hey, the whole field is being talked about in this one section. I should just, take a lot of that out. But it's already talking about someone else's research. So it's great if you want to use the literature review or the background piece, but you have to go back to the original source if you want to use that information. So keep in mind, if you're citing an article, primarily you're going to be citing from the conclusion and discussion section, maybe from the results area as well. So just keep that in mind. And then of course, the last piece of every article is the bibliography. And bibliographies are wonderful because they do some of your work for you. If you find a great article on your topic and you're trying to find more, look at the bibliography from that article. They've already pulled a lot of it together and you don't have to recreate the wheel. You can use what they've already done. Okay, so now I'm going to hand this off to Christy and let her talk about the process of actually writing once you've done all the research.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And I will tell you that there are 2 possibly unanswered questions in the chat if you want to weigh in. Those are out of my scope of knowledge, so I'm going to pass them over to you. So my area of expertise is not searching as Kimberly's is. She's taught me so much, and I wish I knew her when I did my own dissertation. But I like to think a lot about moving from the reading stage to the writing stage. So thinking about how to compose what we're looking at here. One of my favorite books in recent days, and there's a copy in the library. Ever since we started doing this presentation, they purchased a copy of this. It is called Demystifying Dissertation Writing, and it's kind of a humanities-focused book. But what I really like about it is her, the author's interactive reading strategy. And so a lot of these strategies are things that we know to be best practice, but she puts it so simply. So you'll see on the screen, there is a highlighter with a red X through it or red line through it, because counterintuitively, highlighting is the worst thing you can do while you're reading. Highlighting is a passive act that when you're highlighting, all you're thinking is, I'm highlighting. Oh, I went too far in the highlighting, right? We've all had that moment. And so instead, Boyle Single says, here are the steps to think about having really active reading conversations so you know what you want to take from the reading to your literature review or to other projects. So rather than a highlighter, she says to open up your document or your book and with a pencil in your hand. Because when you do that, you immediately are going to write things rather than just underline things or just highlight something. And in doing so, you should focus on the big picture. So she recommends you quickly skim through the whole article before taking notes. We also know all articles are organized very similarly, as Kimberly mentioned, and sometimes we read in a different way in articles than we would say if we were picking up a book for fun this weekend, right? So you might take your pencil and skim the conclusion or the implications section to see if it's going to be a useful article for your study. I don't know about you, but I've gotten way into taking notes, and on page like 38, I realized that this is not going to be helpful at all, right? And so I've wasted all that time and all that energy. If you're reading electronically, you might just pull up the document and be ready to make comments on the PDF if that works for you. Or maybe you download it into a Word document and you make comments that way. But it's really important to skim through the whole article, think about the big picture, and then go in and highlight or underline or put a comment on what is absolutely important. I really also like this idea of reading as a project-focused thing. So another author, I think his name is Harris, he says, rather than reading for main idea or for thesis statement, as we're taught to do in secondary school, we should read for the project. So what is the project this author set out to do? What's the big scope of work, perhaps? And where does this article or this book fit within the project? And then we could think further, how does it connect to my project? So this idea of reading as project, not as main idea, really makes the reading process more robust, and we can sort of connect it to our own writing in a better way. Finally, on this slide, I'm really taken by Ken Hyland's suggestion that as we read, we should read for reporting verbs. So different disciplines use different verbs to describe their actions of study, right? Engineers show a thing. Philosophers think a thing. Philosophers are not going to say, I believe this, right? That's not something they would say. Instead, they would say, this is what the evidence shows, or this is what the theory suggests. So really thinking about what verbs are used in the articles that you read for your literature review, and how can you replicate that in your own literature review writing is really useful. We often read just for content, and we sometimes forget to read for genre or for style, which can be really useful. Next slide, please. So here are a little bit more of her interactive reading tips. She also says you should not only read with the pencil in your hand, which I understand is a little bit of an outdated way of reading if we're people that are reading online, but you can think of ways to adapt. But we should also have a simple and replicable system to go from article to article to article. So for example, if you're starting your study now, it's going to be going on for a few years. Trust me on this. I have lots of studies that drag on for quite some time. And you're going to want to be able to go back to those literature pieces that you read early on and quickly denote what the most important parts are, right? And so this is just her suggestion of what things to mark in a text. I do something very similar, but I don't use the hypotheses. I'm a qualitative researcher, so that doesn't really fit. Instead, I really focus on the main ideas or the big ideas from the text. But I try to do the same marks on every article. That way I have sort of something to compare across articles. The most important mark to make is the 3* mark here. That mark denotes the main argument or the main project of the piece. Often I find that at the very end of the article, right? I may find that on the next to last page or somewhere in the discussion. But marking that becomes really important for when I start to classify, as Kimberly talked about earlier, right? This talks about this topic, this talks about that topic, and I'm able to organize by theme in that way. It also helps me figure out why all of these articles are important, right? Like what their main finding is. It's also sometimes useful to denote theory, so that the TH denotes theory, especially if you're researching in a way that requires a theoretical foundation. So that way I can say these theories are similar to what I'm using, these are different, and I'm able to sort things out based on their methods versus based on just their findings. I also often underline things and then I forget why I underline them, right? If we've been in this boat before. And so she recommends that when you underline something that's a particularly useful quotation, so something that you might want to copy word for word, that you put a Q in the margin. That way you know, that's a quote that I thought was really useful that I wanted to replicate. You could also say that you wanted to put an E in the margin for like, this is evidence that I want to make sure to include. So you could sort of mix this up. And then definitely figure out a mark for something that is like, I need to follow up on that. I use an exclamation point as, oh, wow, that's a really big idea that I need to follow up on. But the key is doing this consistently. So figuring out your system, doing it consistently, and using it for all of the papers in one project is really, really useful. Next slide, please. I love concept maps. It took a PhD for me to realize that I am not a linear thinker. Go figure. Like, is anyone really a linear thinker? I would argue no, but I'm not that kind of researcher. So I kept trying to make an outline and to cram all this research I'd done into a very linear outline. And it was so frustrating and so limiting. And so I discovered concept maps and I realized, this is the way to do it. So concept maps are super useful because they allow us to translate really difficult stuff into our own words. So I'm going to distill the important parts of those papers that I read into my own words to put on the concept map to start organizing them into themes. And in doing so, I'm learning about the study, I'm learning about my topic, I'm really learning more about what I'm supposed to be doing. These also help us organize information. We physically draw a line to create connections. And it also lets us know what disciplinary language should I be using, right? What are disciplinary ways of knowing? We'll see that repetition and will start to help me understand the important parts of my research. Next slide. So this is just a little simple, I had a blank moment too, Kimberly. I see how it happens. A little simple concept map that one of my students made. She was just learning what critical literacy was. And so you can start to see that there are things grouping together, right? She has questioning power structures and then she has lots of things grouped around it. She has real world purposes and lots of things grouped around it. So the great thing about concept maps is that while we're taking notes, we're really able to see where things start to fall and group together. And it's super informal. So if we mess it up, no big deal, cross it out, move it over. It really helps with the thinking. I like to use chart paper. I like to use a big Post-it note on my wall. You can't see this side of my office, but there's chart paper all over with all kinds of these things on them because I think there's something about the act of like physically putting it on a paper. But there's lots of computer programs that work and you can just Google concept mapping software and there's lots of free programs as well. Keep clicking those bubbles, Kimberly, if you will. There's more. I think that this takes the place of an outline. So I go from reading to concept mapping to writing my paper. In fact, during my really big papers, I also, I will like write on a little section and I'll cut that little section off and I'll tape it by my computer and I'll type from it. Because all the thinking has been done. The hard part's been done. I just have to write it up at that point, right? The key is to group content and main ideas by theme so that they kind of fall out where these themes are. The best way to organize a literature review is by theme. It really lets us understand what the big ideas of the topic are. And so this is one way to get to organizing by theme. As Kimberly said earlier, always include all citations. You think you will find it later, and you definitely will not find it later. Okay, so we've read, we've taken notes with interactive reading strategies, we've maybe started to make a concept map, and as we're doing that, we might find out that there are different ways to organize different sorts of articles or different pieces of writing that we're trying to carry out here. And so sometimes we want to describe and define. So sometimes in a literature review, one of your sections will be really defining a term, especially if that definition has changed throughout time. That can be really useful. Sometimes we'll compare and contrast. So for example, if I'm thinking about whether we should teach evolution or creationism or some combination of two in the schools, that might be an interesting thing to compare and contrast and see what are the components of both of these, what are the outcomes, what does the science say, right? All of these things can go together. But that last block, analyze and synthesize, is most often what we're looking for in undergraduate and graduate research programs, wherein I can take all these small papers on a similar topic, I can pull out the important parts through analysis, and then I can put all that together and make a synthesizing statement. So here is one statement about one element of my topic. That's sort of what we're trying to get to as we do our literature reviews in classes or for our dissertation. Keep going, if you will. This quote actually is in lots of my writing. I love Flannery O'Connor, and I love this idea of writing to discover what you know. So often we wait to start writing until we think we know what we're doing, and we're doing ourselves a disservice by that, because writing is generative, like we said early on, and by writing, we'll understand what we know. We'll definitely understand what we don't know, right? We might have to go back to the literature and figure out more on a topic. And we also can start to organize. We might say that thing's not working or this thing's not working. So here's a suggestion. When you're starting to write up your literature review, pull out those important points and begin by restating the writer's project in your own words. So that means pull out just looking at your notes, write a sentence or two about the main outcome of the paper that you're reading. And then you might want to return to the text and pull out some key words to say that, like, these are the things that the author was really thinking about. And then make sure that your summary and your key words matches exactly what was being discussed in the paper. So a good way to avoid plagiarism is to not write directly from the paper. That's why the concept map is so important. Put away the paper, use your own learning, your own knowledge, try to write up the summary that you need to put in your literature review or the analysis, and then go back to that paper and check and see if that's accurate. Next slide. So there are three main structures of literature reviews. Chronological just traces a topic's development through time. So it's literally just, it used to be this and now we've gone all the way to this. So DNA study used to be here and now we're here, right? We could trace it through time. It might be by trend. So there's sometimes those shifts in time where, like, this is the popular trend and then it shifts, and this is the popular trend and it shifts. But most often, click that button once, Kimberly. Most often, thematic is the way that we want to go. So a thematic literature review is organized by topic into sections and subsections. And the idea really is to highlight those trends that we've seen in the literature, but also to highlight the big ideas. And by organizing it this way, it becomes very easy for us to say, and then here's the gap. Here's that area that my research is trying to fulfill. Next slide. I have lots of books on this topic. None of them are great on their own. So you have to read pieces and parts of lots of different pieces, lots of different books. I'm seeing that someone already put How to Write a Lot in the chat, huh? That's excellent. So Paul Sylvia wrote 2 different books. He wrote How to Write a Lot, and that's literally how to produce a lot of writing. And then he also wrote this book called Write It Up, which I love. I use it for a class on graduate writing that I teach. He tells us how to go through the academic journal paper writing process, and he's hilarious. It's really easy to read. He's a social scientist. Super useful. The other 2 books come out of the UK, which is where most of the best work on teaching writing is happening right now. And they're about how to write your thesis and dissertation, but they have really good literature review sections there. So I'm happy to direct you toward these books. They're in the library. You can check one out if you're interested in that as well.
Okay, so the last slide that we have here, and well, okay, it's not the last slide, but this slide is just kind of talking about the resources that you have available to you on campus, and also if you're online. The first one is a picture of Ellis Library, which is kind of the big central library on campus, but we do have a number of subject specialized libraries. So if you're not, or I should say if you are in like the vet med school, there's a library over there as well. There's one in health sciences and journalism. There are a bunch of different ones on campus. So that's just a picture of the main one, but we are available online as much as we are in person. Actually, right now, I think it's easier to get a hold of us because our chat is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you can talk to a librarian literally at whatever point in time you focus best. We also are happy to meet and do consultations and do those over Zoom. So again, you don't have to physically be on campus to meet with your librarian, and you can make an appointment with your subject specialist through MU Connect, the same way that you would make a meeting with your advisor or through a number of other options. The middle picture there is the Campus Writing Center. And they often have writing tutors throughout campus. I'm not really sure this semester what that looks like, but I know that they do have online submissions as well, and they will give you feedback on your paper. The phrase that they like to use is that they're not going to go like line by line through your paper with you, but they will help with themes and formatting and general ideas too. So if you have an idea for your paper and you're working through it and you would like to get feedback, the Writing Center is a really good place to go for that one. I'll let Christy talk about
Kimberly, they are doing all online tutoring this year. So
all
usually
online tutoring.
have
Okay,
tutors at the center and in the residence halls and the library, but this year they're all online.
And I see in the chat that a couple of people have asked how you find out who your subject librarian is. And after we're done with the slides, I will pop over to the library page and show you how you can find that contact information. And Christy, do you want to talk about the campus writing program?
Yes, I was putting more things in the chat, lots of resources. So the campus writing program is housed in that beautiful brick house that you see. It's an 1867 Italian Renaissance architecture, if you're interested in that sort of thing, at 6th and Conley. One of us is there every day of the week, mostly. We have one faculty member in quarantine, you know how all that is. So everyone, we are there often, but the best way to reach us is via email right now as well. But I have dropped in the chat our CWP events. So as I mentioned, we work with the Writing Intensive Undergraduate Course Program. Our goals are to support undergraduate and graduate writing by training up faculty members on how to teach writing even better. But we also support graduate writers in a lot of different ways. This morning we had our first virtual writing corner, for example, where we had 30 minutes to come together to work on a writing strategy to try to generate more writing. Those are free to you. They're done virtually all until further notice, and they're under our CWP events page there. So as Kimberly mentioned, we support faculty, faculty and also graduate writers, but we are not the ones that you take your papers to. We're more of the faculty facing part. So our colleagues over at the Writing Center, that picture in the middle, they're the ones that can look at your papers and they're excellent as well. I put their information in the chat. And then finally, a self-serving comment. I teach a brand new graduate writing course. This is the second semester that I'm teaching it, and I dropped a flyer in there. I think it will be offered either spring or fall, but if you're new to graduate study and you feel like you need a writing course to support you, would love to have you there. Pass it back over to Kimberly.
And the final image on this page at the very bottom there is MoSpace. MoSpace is our institutional repository, which basically means we digitize and make available online the things that are produced at the University of Missouri. So this means dissertations. If you write a dissertation, your dissertation will be published in MoSpace. The default is that it gets published. You can require that to be behind a login so that only MU people have access if you plan to like publish a book with it or something. But our goal is to make the research that's done at the University of Missouri as accessible as possible, to keep it from being behind paywalls. So these are articles and dissertations, and if you present at a conference posters, it can be any academic piece of creativity that is made by someone at MU. And then it's findable through things like Google Scholar. So other academics around the world would have access to your materials. The other benefit for you is, and that a lot of you mentioned in the chat earlier that you're looking to write a dissertation, is that you can find dissertations in your subject field from your advisor that have already successfully been defended. So you can get an example of what the format should look like, what those verbs are and what the language is, like Christy mentioned before, and kind of see what's been done in your department up to this point, and maybe just get an example of what that should look like, which I find to be really helpful in my own research and work. Okay, so then our last slide here should be our questions of what do you think from today. So if you have any final questions, please let us know in the chat. And if not, let us know what one takeaway is. And during that, while you do that write-up, I'm going to hop over to the library's webpage and show you how you can find your subject librarian. And then Heather asked, for longer term projects, what's the best way to stay up to date with relevant papers as they're published? You can set databases in your subject field to give you notifications on certain topics. And I do believe that another one of the workshops that's being offered does talk about how to do that and some of those tricks for staying up to date in the field. And I know even if you're not doing a literature review, this is a really good thing. If there's a couple topics that you're trying to stay really at the forefront of the field on, setting an alert, it'll send you an email every time a paper is published. And you can set it up so it's not every time, like you get that report once a week or something. But yes, you can set up reports in databases to notify you when new things are published in your field, which is kind of neat.
Add to that, I am a lower tech version. Kimberly knows much more about these tricks than I do. There's only about 4 journals in my field that publish things similar to my work. And so I kind of know when those come out, and I set a time on my calendar to review the table of contents of those every time that they come out. So I may not read the whole journal, but I just skim through and I mark the things that are interesting. So if your field is kind of like mine, a circumscribed, smaller field, that's a great way to keep track of it and see who's writing what. I even look for names that I know, and that's pretty helpful.
Yeah, finding a journal. I know a lot of fields have like a very specific 1 or 2 journals that they follow. Applied behavioral analysis, they have a journal called Java, and that's like the one journal that they are really into. So everyone has to read everything in Java every time it comes out. Okay, so if you want to know who your subject librarian is, the very bottom left of this library homepage, there's a Contact Us link. If you go to Contact Us, there's a couple things to note about this page. 1, there's lots of different ways to reach out. Our chat box is there, phone number, email, all of that. So you could just reach out in general, but there's also this yellow subject librarians tab. I'm actually kind of glad we're showing this because there are yellow tabs on a lot of the library pages. And there's usually really good information hidden behind those yellow tabs. So if you see tabs across the top of a page, please click on them. There's really good information under them. And so subject librarians is where you're going to find the expert person who would work with each of the different departments and programs that exist here at the University of Missouri. And then you can find, of course, their phone number, their email, and if you are a student and you go through MU Connect, it should have your subject librarian based on either the classes you're taking, if you haven't declared a major, if you're not in a graduate program very specifically, or if you are in a declared major program, then it should auto-populate with who your subject librarian is. Okay, let's see. Are there any other questions? Oh, the STAR program. I mentioned this at the beginning, but in case we've had a couple other people join us, if you're an undergraduate student who wants to get credit for the STAR program, please let me know in the chat box. You can send me a private chat to let me know. I did go back and list all of the people's names who wrote that down earlier. So thank you for doing that. If there's anyone else who would like credit for that program, let me know. Not seeing any other questions, I'm going to jump back to our first slide because our email addresses are on that slide. So if you have any questions, please do reach out. We're happy to answer email or meet in person over Zoom or anything like that, whatever's most useful for you. I'm not seeing any other questions. I think we went a little over. Our plan was to take up about the amount of time that a class period would. We covered very basic information. There are a lot of other workshops about creating research identities. So if you're doing a lot of publishing and you want to know about how to create research IDs and how to set up things like journal alerts, we do have other workshops on those. Those are on the library's calendar, the same way that you registered for this workshop. But then again, you can also send me an email and ask for more information about it. So thanks for your time, and I'll stay around for a couple more minutes in case people have questions. Feel free to turn on your microphone as well, since we haven't had too much chatter going on. I think it should be fine.
This is Corey McNeil. Got a question. I was curious about where you store your PDFs, or even if you do store your PDFs, are you simply linking to them, or do you actually download them and put them on a hard drive or in another cloud and reference them?
So I tend to store mine in Mendeley. You can request that all of the PDFs, like as you're sending citations to your citation management tool, that it also pulls a PDF, but that does take a lot of storage. So usually I wait until I get to the point where I've gone through abstracts and titles and kind of weeded out the ones I know I'm not going to look at. And then once I have a group and I think, okay, well, these are going to be the ones I definitely want to dig deeper into, then there's a pull PDF. So for the folder of the final articles that I want to use, I can pull all the PDFs into Mendeley and look at them there. So that's one way. I've seen different people use different versions. Box is a pretty common one that some of my collaborators have used. I've worked on one project where we used Google Drive because the collaborators were at a lot of different universities, so not everyone had the same file cloud sharing ability. So Google Drive just was the common denominator. So I don't know if that's the right or wrong way to do it. The journalism school does have a really good program called, I think it's called JAM. Might be JAM. I can look it up and send it to you, but it's about file naming conventions. And I think that's almost more important even than where you store them. It's backing it up multiple locations. So if you lose one location, you don't lose all of your work, and it's naming it so that you can find it again later.
Okay, thank you.
I organize mine with, so I write in APA format mostly, and I organize mine with author, last name, at least the first author and the year. Those are the things I tend to remember, and I often put them in themed folders. So after I figure out sort of where they fit, and I'm all Google Drive, I use Google Drive for everything. So that works really well because even yesterday I was like, I know that this was this person's last name. So I searched that author and I found all the articles I had from them and I could pull the one that I was looking for. So again, low tech, but it works for me.
It does. You have to remember the author's last names though, and sometimes I'm really bad at that. I should. The ones I see a lot I'm good with, but if I've only seen it once or twice, it's...
Well, you work in a lot of different fields. I just have the one to deal with, so.
I think you find what works for you and then you stick to it. That's really the key.